good afternoon, and I think also good morning to the most of you. Thank you so much for taking the time despite the late/early hours. It's wonderful to see that we can join from around the world. And I'd like to welcome you to our second expert discussion on innovation policy for Eastern Europe and South Caucasus. So as some of you might know, we've started this expert discussion series as part of our national focal point meetings in the region, continuing an important legacy that we've created over the past years with our work with the countries. And this is a relatively new format, so it's in the form of smaller, more informal presentations and casual discussions with leading international experts, also complementing the other types of working meetings that we have been organizing and are organizing within this group, such as the policy dialogue sessions and the coordination meetings. And at this stage, I'd also like to thank the Swedish government for funding these initiatives that we have been able to conduct. So in this vein, I'll maybe provide a brief overview of what you can expect from today's discussion. So in the first half, I have the pleasure of speaking to our esteemed guest, who will provide us a little bit more information on his experience, on his work, on the topic. And then in the second half of the session, we will open the floor for comments and questions from participants. So please feel free during the discussion, think about some questions or comments. Feel free to add them in the chat, but also know that we will provide you with the opportunity to ask them yourself as well. So I would also ask you to, if you have a question, please raise your hand. You can see that on the raise your hand function on the top bar, and then we will make sure to give you the opportunity to speak. So with that said, and without any further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce our esteemed guest with a very impressive career, Professor Michael Munger, political economist and professor of political science, economics, and public policy at Duke University, and the director of Duke Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program. Welcome, Mike. We're honored to be able to speak with you today. Thank you so much for joining. And how are you doing? Perhaps you'd like to say a few words about yourself. And I'd love to hear about the unicorn in your background.
The unicorn is pretty obtrusive. Thank you. It is great to be here. The unicorn is my spirit animal. If you look closely, you'll see several. There's a smaller unicorn on the other side of it. There's probably 100 different little unicorn things, some of which I get in the mail almost every week from anonymous people. So if you Google Munger unicorn, a number of things will come up. I have, somewhere around 5 or 7 years ago, it struck me that in public policy, we often talk past each other because each of us can imagine a state of the world where our ideal society is realizable. And you might say, well, that doesn't exist, but like unicorns, it does exist. If I say the word unicorn and we all close our eyes, an image appears. And the image is actually pretty similar. We have a pretty shared conception of what that is. So I have friends on the left who, when they see actual real world attempts to implement socialism, they say, well, no, that's not real socialism. But I have plenty of friends on the right, when they say markets or capitalism, they dismiss instances of cronyism. Well, that's not real capitalism. But if that's what capitalism becomes, that's what you have to take seriously from a public policy perspective. And so I have unicorns in my office so that we can have fewer of them in public policy.
That's extremely interesting, and we'll definitely make sure to Google Munger and unicorns.
There's a 4-minute video that will change your life.
Excellent. I think that's a great first step after our today's discussion to look into that video. Thanks so much, Mike. And so maybe turning to today's discussion. So we'll be talking about how we can leverage the platform and sharing economy beyond the large platforms that we know as well, such as Facebook and Uber, and how these can really reduce transaction costs and change the way we use physical products and assets, but also fundamentally change the way we consume. So as the platform economy is rapidly expanding in P2P, B2B, B2C transactions, they're starting to not only concern physical products and assets, such as power tools, food waste, housing, and car sharing, but also intangible assets, right? So such as skills and labor, For example, in business process outsourcing, personal services, distant learning, but also, P2P financing. So this trend, these dynamics, they have significant implications on how we create value, because they can also in turn change the nature of firms and entire value chains. And with this, these represent significant opportunities also for UNECE program countries, right? Specifically those in transition. So just to start us off, Mike, you've authored quite a few books in the past years on the sharing economy, transaction costs, and what you call tomorrow 3.0. So would love to hear about what inspired you to write these books, and what is tomorrow 3.0, and why is it important?
Well, like any professor, I tend to talk in 75-minute increments. So I did not use PowerPoint today so that none of us would be subjected to that. So I will give a summary, recognizing in advance that the summary will be inadequate. The reason I called the book Tomorrow 3.0, in addition to the fact that it's grandiose and it's sort of arresting to that you think I'd like to know more about that. But my claim is that we're in the midst of the third great economic revolution. The first was the Neolithic, the transition from hunter-gatherer society to fixed agriculture. And the problem, some people have called this the Neolithic revolution the greatest fraud ever perpetrated on humanity. Because if you look before and after the Neolithic revolution, hunter-gatherers were taller, they had better teeth because they had better diets, they actually had longer lives. So after the Neolithic revolution, fixed agriculture actually reduced the quality of people's lives. However, because it was a gigantic increase in the amount of food and the amount of things that we could produce because of division of labor, there were 100 times as many people on the earth, and soon there were 1,000 times as many people on the earth. So the reason to start there is to remember that economic revolutions don't care what we think of them. They may actually be worse off. So people that I've been asked, well, why would they do that then if it made the individual worse off? And the answer is there's an economic logic that's underlying the revolution that makes it irresistible. The second great revolution, likewise, the Industrial Revolution, was catastrophic for many people in the first 50 years. So the transition to the commodification of labor and the pricing of things that until now had been bartered or exchanged in smaller communities meant that you had to have some sort of income producing activity. And the thing that we now call a job didn't exist before the Industrial Revolution. There was a thing that you did. After the Industrial Revolution, people had jobs. Was that good? Economic revolutions don't care. It was necessary because of the logic of economic change. So my claim is we're in the middle of the third great economic revolution, and people have pointed to various causes. They call it the information revolution. I would say there are two factors at work here. One is the reduction in transactions cost. And I have claimed that the way to define transaction cost is the combination of three things that also start with TR to make them easy to remember: triangulation, transfer, and trust. We have to be able to find each other. We have to be able to locate the products. Transfer is we have to be able to deliver the product and collect payment in a way that is transparent and easy. And trust is we have to be able to rely on the assurances of each other that we're not going to harm each other and we're going to receive what we actually expect. The other thing that is operating is the commodification of excess capacity. There's more than enough stuff in the world, but we're paying to store it instead of use it. So if I'm driving in New York or if I'm in London and Paris, a lot of these roads are quite wide. There's a lot of capacity, but remarkably, we're using some of the most expensive real estate in the world to store empty cars. I think people will look back at this just 20 years from now and say, why would they be storing empty cars on roads that could have been used for bikes, for walking, for other things? So if we can commodify excess capacity, and the most obvious example, people in Europe will recognize this, it doesn't exist in the US, most obvious example is BlaBlaCar. So BlaBlaCar, if I'm in Brno, I want to go to Prague tomorrow morning, I've actually done this, at 9 o'clock in the morning, I can find a truck driver who is going to drive from Brno to Prague, and I can get it for the equivalent of 12 euros. in Czech krona. So that's terrific, because that truck is going to Prague tomorrow anyway. But that seat would have been empty. If we can commodify that and sell it, so there's no increase in the amount of stuff, but it's more efficient use of the stuff we have already. So if you combine those two things, transactions cost, and remember, transaction cost is like friction in a physical system. In a physical system, we try to find ways to reduce friction because it just gets burned off as heat. Energy is diverted just into heat. You're not getting the full energy of the system. If you reduce the friction, the energy becomes more efficient. The system becomes more efficient. Transaction costs mean that many mutually beneficial exchanges and just large kinds of cooperation can all happen because we've reduced the transactions cost of people finding each other, triangulation, delivering the service and paying for it, transfer, and being able to trust each other that we can actually rely on assurance. However, I think we're also going to face the downside. We're in for decades of disruption that may be on the order of what happened in the Neolithic and the Industrial Revolution. There's likely to be a substantial increase in inequality for people who, like me, are able to take advantage of the opportunities in the new economy, and people who have a high school education who until now have worked on the thing that is now dying called jobs. So we didn't have jobs until the Industrial Revolution, and we're going to not see jobs 20 or 30 years from now. It's going to change into gigs or short-term employment. We have to try to prepare the world. It's going to happen, but we have to prepare the world of people to be able to take advantage of this. The third thing that is important, and I said I would be brief, and I already haven't been, but the third thing that's important is that for many nations that don't have the institutions that until now we've always said are required for development, so an advanced financial system, a judicial system, Tomorrow 3.0 will create a set of platforms that will allow developing nations to leapfrog over all the intervening stages, because blockchain and other platforms will replace the need for those complicated government institutions. And so there may be a silver lining to some of the downside.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And so you mentioned transaction costs, and this also has implications on what Ronald Coase then also defined as transaction costs, right? So how to really determine the balance between market exchanges and the central control structures of organizations. So basically the make or buy decision, right? And then you also pointed out, as we also referred to, the 3 T's, right? So triangulation, trustworthiness, and transfer. And perhaps maybe we could look into some additional examples. So you mentioned BlaBlaCar. That's also a platform, but also in the line of the sharing economy. So are there any other examples you could showcase where really the sharing economy and the platform economy have shown some success in that regard? I think you also mentioned in one of your previous books the example of power drills.
Yes. And again, I'm going to try not to talk for an hour. So let me start by giving you a reference. So I've put in chat a link to a book that I published more recently. It's called The Sharing Economy, and it's about platforms. It was published by IEA in London. And if you go to that link, it's available as a free download. So it is easy to get the entire book for free as a PDF. In that book, my argument is that transactions take place. And I'm trying to make a pun, and I'm sorry, puns particularly don't translate very well, maybe for people whose English is not their first language. So transactions take place mean they happen, but it also means they require a location. And for most of human history, they required a physical location. For the first time, they can take a virtual location. So briefly, let's go back 3,500 years. I have spent the entire summer and fall growing millet, and I have 3 bags of millet, and that is the entire output of my small farm for the year. I need to find a way to sell it or exchange it for the products my family needs. At first, I go into the middle of a field because I don't want to be at a place where other people are selling millet. I want a better price. After about 2 hours, I notice there's no one else in the middle of the field. Darn it, I think. I had better go to the marketplace. Well, there was a marketplace. It was called the souk. And so what does a souk sell? And the answer is nothing. It sells connections. There's a stall in the souk, and I can go there and rent that. Other people know that if I go to the souk, they can find things to buy or they themselves can sell it. So there's the triangulation problem is solved. Transfer means that I can deliver it pretty easily. They have carts, they can pay money. We have established a set of conventions for exchange, and there is security. There's people with swords and spears and archers to protect against attack except anything by a major army. So thieves are not able to take things in the souk. So the souk was a physical place that solved the problem of triangulation, transfer, and trust. Now, that was the way things worked for a long time. But in the United States, in the late 19th century, there was the first virtual platform, and it was called the Sears Catalog. What did the Sears catalog sell? It was a 1,000-page book. Sears they owned a railroad company, and he wanted to increase the volume of traffic on the railroad company, but it turned out that selling a place for exchange to take place was the more profitable proposition. So what the Sears catalog sold was a quarter or a half or an entire page where you could put a picture of the thing that you wanted to sell. So not the thing, but a picture of the thing and the price, and you could deliver it. So if I live in a small town in the American Midwest in the late 19th century, there might be a hardware store. They would have 100 items for sale. The Sears catalog had 5,000 things for sale, all clothing items, tools, all sorts of things I could never get. And they guaranteed that I could find them. I could pay Sears. Sears would deliver them. And importantly, if it didn't work or it broke, I could return it. And that meant that the Sears catalog solved the problems of triangulation, transfer, and trust. Now, there came to be physical manifestations of the souk that we call malls. They mostly no longer exist. There's a few still, but the malls are struggling because the virtual souk called Amazon or other online retailers, eBay, those all are virtual places. None of them sell stuff. What they sell is connections. Once you start to think in those terms, you recognize there's other platforms that do that also. What does Uber sell? Does it sell taxi rides? It does not. It sells connections. So if I have a car in a few minutes and you need a ride, we have a hard time finding each other. Plus, I have a black BMW. And so, I pull up beside a young woman who's walking and I roll down the window and I say, "Hey, baby, you need a ride?" She calls the police because it's creepy. However, it is actually true that if I have a car in a few minutes and someone else needs a ride, it should be possible to have a mutually beneficial transaction. So we have to take the creepy out of it. So I can commodify the excess capacity I have in my car. I can commodify the excess capacity that I have in my apartment in New York City or London using the platform of Airbnb. What does Airbnb sell? It sells connections. It sells reliable connections that solve the problem of triangulation, transfer, and trust. So once you start to think in terms of those platforms, you can recognize that reducing transactions cost and commodifying excess capacity will allow us to take much better advantage of the things that we already have. So the economy doesn't need to be circular as much as we need to find ways to share things. So Spinlister is a platform in which, for example, I taught at a university in Bavaria in Germany in 2009, and it was pretty hard to rent a bike. But a lot of people leave and they had to pay to store their bike. Suppose that I could rent from the people who otherwise would have been storing their bikes because we could find each other, we could pay and deliver, and we could trust that the bike would be returned. Turo is, I fly almost every week. So I go to an airport, I arrive at the other airport, and I have a policy. When I travel, I never buy a car. I always, that was a joke. I never buy a car, I always rent one. And so I walk past giant parking lots full of cars to get to the Hertz counter where I can rent a car. What if you could rent the cars that people now are paying 30 euros a day to store? So suppose I could rent it for 20 euros a day. I'm making 50 euros a day. because I'm not paying the $30 to store it and I'm making 20. And we need far less parking lots at airports. So once you start to think of any excess capacity as being a possible income producing asset, instead of something that I need to spend money and space on storing, the possibilities of platforms just seem endless. It's going to transform the world.
Yeah, absolutely. As we also sometimes phrase it, basically doing more with less, right? So as you mentioned, commodification of excess capacity. And so, I mean, you gave the example of the souk. So the notion of platform economy is not new, right? So what is new here is technology, right? The development of a technology, the increased connectivity, the increased affordability of technology. So that's really what's transforming and providing these new opportunities. So you also maybe to go into the third T, the trustworthiness, right? So how what options are there to address the issue of trust, and what role can newer technologies play in also enhancing the transparency here?
Well, that's a good news, bad news situation. So in order to conserve on time, I deferred on the power drill question, but I will now take it up because it's relevant to this. People think of Uber as being a taxi company, but at first, Amazon was a book company. It just turned out that Amazon's platform was very well suited for also selling many other things. So Amazon still sells books, but that's not their primary goal. What they're selling is connections. So in my book, I describe renting power tools. And so suppose that I need a power drill. Um, well, that's actually not true. What I need is 2 1/4-inch holes in this wall now. The easiest way for me to get that until now has been to own a power drill. So whereas Ronald Coase in 1937 asked a great question, if markets are so great, why are there firms? And the answer is transaction costs. Well, if I need 2 1/4-inch holes in this wall right now, why do I own a power drill? Different question, same answer. The answer is transaction costs. It is hard for me to acquire the drill that I only need for about 3 minutes. And so I buy it and I store it in my garage. And that's a terrible waste of resources. In every house, as you go by, there's a power drill that's almost never used. Suppose instead I could go to my phone and I open up an app called, surprisingly, Uber. And I go to Power Tools and I press that I want to rent it. 7 minutes later, a smart pod in front of my house sends my phone a notification saying that my commercial quality power drill has been delivered. And it's been delivered by an autonomous car with no human driver, and it's making many deliveries in my neighborhood because the density of transactions is so high. I go out, I get the power drill, I put the 2 holes in the wall, I put the drill back in the smart pod. 10 minutes later, and another autonomous Uber car picks it up and takes it to its next use. It gets used 10, 12, 15 times every day. And I don't have to pay to store it. And it's a better drill than I would have acquired if I had purchased one myself, because I don't use it that often. I'd probably buy a not very good one. Now, why is this Uber? The answer is you think Uber is a taxi company, but it's actually a delivery company. So I have an app and I can either say I'd like a taxi or I can say I'd like a power drill. So Uber is not primarily a threat to taxi companies. It's a threat to Amazon. Uber and Amazon are the two great platforms. Amazon specializes in ownership, whereas Uber specializes in renting and short-term use and sharing. So I think the expansion, if you Google Uber but for and then just fill in some noun, there may very well be some company that contracts with Uber to deliver the stuff. Food we're all kind of used to, but there's Uber but for puppies. I'm feeling sad. I'd like a puppy for an hour, please. And so it will deliver the puppy. Now you have to solve the problem of trust. Young people are sort of used to this. Old people, I think, probably find it creepy. I have a friend, Russ Roberts, who does a podcast called Econ Talk. And the first time he heard of Airbnb, he said, nobody will ever use that. That's creepy. You're going to stay in somebody's apartment and they have the key. That sounds terrible. It sounds like some kind of horror movie. No, don't go through that door. But the fact is that we have reviews, we have financial information, we have a lot of way to certify this. And so when you think about it, reviews are a set of independent judgments that have been rendered about the quality and reliability of some good or service. And so young people are much more likely to trust reviews on something like Yelp. If you want to know what restaurant to go to, young people don't ask the concierge, they look at Yelp reviews. If I want to know what movie to go to, I go to Rotten Tomatoes because there's many different independent judgments that have been rendered about this. It can be manipulated, but not as easily as advertising. And so the availability of reviews, wide, big scale reviews, if you look at the average, it actually probably tells you something. So is this Airbnb nice? The pictures look good, but that's easily faked. However, the reviews say this is a great place to stay. I can, in some measure, rely on this. But like everything, there's a downside. Suppose that we start to use reviews and make them portable. So I've been a host on Airbnb, but I want to open a small business and get a loan. I want to make my reputation on Airbnb as being reliable. I want to make that portable. So we'll have some sort of aggregate score. We have a nonprofit organization that has aggregate scores. The government recognizes, boy, that's really interesting. We will use that, we'll call it a social credit score, and we will add information about whether anyone in their family is a dissident. We will add information about whether they have participated or been seen in meetings using retina identification in protests. Well, so if we rely on reputations to that extent to reduce transactions cost, both corporations and governments might very well sell that information in ways that we're not happy with. So the problem with economic revolutions is they don't care what we think of them. So it's easy just to walk along this path and say, I'd like to reduce transactions cost. And so having all my information public, that's okay. Well, maybe it is. We actually don't know the implications of having all our information public.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, so I mean, so how does blockchain come into this equation? What potential do you see there?
Now I'm going to talk for an hour. I'm sorry. I've held myself back as long as I can. So the problem for what economists call public goods is the free rider problem. So the reason that we need something like a state or some central organization to provide public goods is that if I try to charge what people are willing to pay for public goods, they'll hope that other people will provide it and they can free ride. They won't have to pay anything. So, a common example is national defense. The only way that we can fund public goods is if we charge taxes, because if we have a bake sale or rely on voluntary compliance with people paying, then it's a problem. However, at least in small settings, blockchain and smart contracts can help us solve the problem of free riding. So imagine that I live in a small town in Estonia, and there's some potholes in the road because the winter is very long and hard. So there's big holes in the road that need to be fixed. The school needs a new toilet. The town hall, the walls need to be painted, and the lawn needs to be mowed in the Central Park. Now, we could have a public works crew that does all those things. So, a set of government employees that go and does that. It's not clear in what order they do those things, and maybe they don't even know that there's a pothole. So they have a problem with information, and that sort of public works crew, at least in the US, is famous for, there's 4 people with shovels, 3 of them are leaning on the shovel, and 1 of them is digging. So, maybe the motivation for fast work is not so great. Suppose instead that you had something like what we in the US call a wedding registry. I don't know if that's the right term, but so a couple is going to get married and they'll put up online a list of things that they need. And it's a way of reducing transaction costs. So I don't want 3 toasters and no espresso machine. I want 1 of each, and then I also want some other things. And people get to, the name of the person is there so they can take credit for it. So in the Estonian town registry, they have the list of the things that I just said. We need to mow the lawn, we need to fix the potholes, and we need to put a new toilet in the school. So I can sign up for my tax money to go to the activity that I actually think is most important, and I can add things. and say, there's another pothole that I would like my money to go to be fixed. Now, we have a blockchain operating in the background. We have a smart contract operating in the background. The money that I have committed goes into escrow, but the contract doesn't execute until everyone has committed to pay their money to fix one of these things that the town needs. And all of this then is credited against our tax liability. So this money is going to be taken anyway because I owe the taxes. But I can do two things. One, I can suggest information and priority to the town authorities about what is important. And the second thing is that I have some sense of ownership or participation in the state, because in my community, really, that because this is the one that I care about. And so my money actually goes to those things. If at some point, all of us will have signed up for some local public works project, and the smart contract executes the contract, the money is transferred. We put out bids to private contractors for all of these. So all this work can be done on the same day. It all gets done very quickly with private contractors. And then we don't have to pay the overhead. We don't have to pay there's a problem. Jobs are disappearing. We're using contractors instead of full-time government employees with benefits, but it's much cheaper and more efficient. So the result is that all of those things then get done pretty quickly, and they're done much more cheaply, and I have more of a sense of participation. So if we have the advantage of smart contracts is that it solves the free rider problem, because the contract doesn't execute until everyone has committed. Now, you don't have to. You can just lay out and your money will be taken in taxes like it always is, because you didn't sign up to pay anything for a specific project. So the town still has some money to operate on, but it's a much more efficient system for getting work done at the local level. And notice that what the app that does this, all that it's selling really is connections. The connection here is among people, though, in the entire community. It allows us to cooperate at much lower cost. So a lot of things that are called public goods are only public goods because the transaction cost of organizing groups of people is so high. Using smart contracts and blockchain, I think, will allow us to a number of government functions that they're sort of cumbersome, they're slow, they're expensive. It'll be speeded up so much that it'll be hard to imagine we ever did it any other way.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. And maybe just going into, I think you've touched upon this already in a few instances, but what are the main stumbling blocks? What are the main risks associated with sharing economy and the platform economy in this context? So what implications does it have for regulatory challenges, for example?
The big one is giantism. So in the United States, my next book will be about antitrust, or what Europeans call competition policy. And so the problem is, suppose that you have an idea for a new home sharing, apartment sharing app, and it's better than Airbnb. Airbnb is kind of clunky. You get it written, you put up your website, you breathlessly await your first customers. People go on your apartment sharing app and they say, this is great. It's really transparent. I can get a lot of information. And then they go to look at apartments and there aren't any listed. And then a few people list their apartment, but they have no reviews. And now we're back to creepy. This is a person I don't know, and they have the key to the apartment. So I say, well, gosh, okay. I go to Airbnb, and the apartment that I'm looking at has 1,000 reviews, and 950 of them are excellent. I can rely on that. And so it's what economists call an entry barrier. The fact that these first movers have very large portfolios of reviews on both the buy side and the sell side. It's very difficult for anyone else to overcome that. If you have a new ride sharing app and you want to compete with Uber and Lyft, then you don't have reviews of these people, and it's hard to solve the trust problem. So the way that we solve the trust problem is large numbers of independent reviews. but those actually constitute entry barriers in the sense that anybody else, it's going to take years for you to get to the point where you have enough reviews that you might be able to start paying your bills. You have to have a gigantic amount of capital to enter this industry, and you're going to hemorrhage money for years. Well, it has been suggested that that sort of giantism. I used to work for the Federal Trade Commission in Washington. My first job was at doing antitrust work at the U.S. Federal Trade Commission. And the concern was if there's only one firm and it's a monopoly, they'll charge excessive prices and it'll stifle innovation. Well, in this case, the ideal industry structure is one or a small number of firms because this problem of giantism, breaking them up won't help. You actually need the company to have a large number of reviews. So antitrust is probably not the right answer, but there is a problem. Having these giant corporations, Amazon, Google, Facebook even has enormous political power, not just economic, but political power. And so the problem with the platform economy is that it creates irresistible incentives for giantism, which then, if you have concentrations of economic power, that can metastasize into concentrations of political power. And so I don't think we have an answer. I think that antitrust is not breaking them up is not the answer. But there is a problem, and we haven't actually figured out what the problem is yet. Until we do that, it's going to be hard to figure a solution.
Excellent, thank you. I think, yes, it's also sometimes referred to as network externalities, right?
Yeah.
So for a platform to truly provide value, they need a certain minimum amount of people engaged in the platform. So maybe if we move on to sort of the policy side of it. So specifically in our region in Eastern Europe and South Caucasus, what do you see as the policy implications if these countries would like to embrace the sharing and platform economy? And just maybe also already inviting the participants to start raising their hands and think of questions that they can also ask Mike. So yeah, what are the policy implications specifically for Eastern Europe and the South Caucasus? Where should they start?
Excuse me. I think there's two ways to think about the change that we're facing. One is separation, and the other is saltation. So separation means that the wealthy will continue to grow wealthier. And so those countries and those people within countries who know how to code, who have fast internet access and are able to participate in the sharing economy will become much more wealthier. And even if they don't become wealthier, the price to them of using things is going to fall. So even if my wages don't go up, the price of using and renting things is going to fall so dramatically that we're going to become more prosperous. However, there are many people in wealthy nations who don't have those things, and they're going to become relatively and maybe even absolutely poorer because the 40-hour-a-week job is going to disappear. Or if you're in France, the 30-hour-a-week job will disappear. So the that's separation. So we may get change that increases separation and inequality. On the other hand, saltation is a sort of leapfrogging where it comes from rocks in a stream that get pushed down. But saltation would mean that you could leapfrog. And until now, if you were to ask someone, I studied with Douglas North, a Nobel Prize winner in economics, and after he won the Nobel Prize, you do this world tour where people say, well, Professor North, you've won the Nobel Prize. Do you have any advice about how we can advance economically and politically? And he would say, the first thing you'll need is a different history. Well, gosh, that's very helpful. Thanks very much. But what he meant was you don't have the political, judicial, and financial institutions to start on the stairway to development. But platforms are a substitute for having a reliable, non-corrupt police and judicial system, because we can write smart contracts that will self-execute and that can't be corrupted. So I can't work around this. I can't pay off a judge. I can't have a policeman who will arrest you if you don't do something, because smart contracts will allow us to leap over the need. So in Somalia, many contracts are negotiated and then paid using Bitcoin. because there's no basic local currency that's accepted everywhere. But using Bitcoin and even a primitive smart contract means that I can engage in exchange. And Somalia has almost no institutions that function in the traditional sense. So developing nations, instead, the advice has always been, well, you'll need these institutions. You need an independent judiciary and a non-corrupt police force. That's really hard to do. Those are wrenching changes, and it takes decades. And so it's frustrating. I'm a politician. I've got to win the next election. And you tell me all these things are really costly and it'll help 20 years from now. I don't think so. I'm going to do something much more short term. But if we have platforms that will allow us to solve some of these problems at the margin, reducing the transactions cost of many forms of local exchange and local public goods of the kind that I talked about with the Estonian village, you can have saltation. You can have change that allows you to leapfrog over the need to develop in slow, painful ways these developed institutions.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mike. I'll give the opportunity for the participants to raise their hand. Are there any questions from the floor to Mike? Maybe any in the chat? Specifically our focal points in the region, if you have any questions or comments on what we talked about thus far. Okay, so while we wait for the questions to roll in, so from a policy perspective, what are the first steps needed to enable platforms to first be created, but also grow and scale up to the necessary size?
It is actually a daunting prospect for many nations where government sense of security is not strong, to say we're going to allow our citizens to have direct, unlimited, fast internet access. And so, because that also can be used by dissidents or maybe outsiders to weaken the government. And so it's easy for me to talk about what you need is fast internet access. Well, okay, the infrastructure required for that is pretty expensive because for the most part it takes either wires or some system. 5G is a little different. If nations can get to the point where they're using 5G networks, it's much more compatible with widespread internet use. So we wouldn't need fiber optic cables to go everywhere. But 5G is very expensive to implement. So the universal fast internet access would be one of the most important things. And that's if I'm a government official in a nation that doesn't have a tradition of government stability, I probably have some questions about that. On the other hand, you can mostly do this with smartphones. And in some cases, you can just do it with feature phones because you can do it with the equivalent of a DOS operating system. It takes a while, but if the cost of labor is relatively low, you can also operate these systems on just feature phones. And that's the way it happens pretty often in Somalia. One thing that international agencies might focus on is to try to make it easier and cheaper and safer for developing nations to have universal internet access so that more and more people, the biggest difference, it used to be electrification. The big difference in developing nations is if electricity is all over the country, it makes an enormous difference for me to have lights to be able to operate a washing machine. Now the new electrification is access to some form of reasonably fast internet connection so that I can participate in the sharing economy on platforms. So if that happens, then just the natural value of these things, I think, will lead people to start developing them. On the other hand, and I hate to keep coming back to this, in the previous revolutions, there's 50, 100, 200 years that were terrible. And a policy implication might be anticipating that, how can we improve the outlook and situation of those who are least well off so they have some sense of hope and participation? I don't want to talk too much about the US presidential election, but it's at least hypothetically possible that a demagogue who tells people that there's evil things in the world and these immigrants keep coming in and that's the reason that our economy is bad, You can win elections by doing that. So we have to improve both the position and expectations of those who are least well off to make people less susceptible to the blandishments of demagogues. And so both of those two things may seem sort of unrelated, but I have a faith that this is going to happen anyway. So universal internet connections and a a safety net that gives people a sense of less precariousness. There's a lot of uncertainty, there's going to be, but some sense that there's a limit on how much bad stuff can happen to me. Those two things, if we could just start on those two things, I think it would make a big difference.
Excellent. Yeah. So addressing the inclusivity and also reducing what we sometimes call the digital divide, right? Which is still unfortunately very present. So I see we have some hands here. Ludmila, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you a lot for giving me a floor. Thank you, Mike, for just so impressing theory and this idea of big and fundamental link between platforms and political issues. In light of current situation, in light of war in Ukraine, and just a few days as this fresh information about stopping of activity for Amazon and Microsoft in Russia, I just wonder to ask you about these two big blocks, if you can say in the word, and in terms of platform economy, what does it mean? It means that one block platforms and other block platforms, and it's like kind of also like cold or not very cold war, but on the level of platform economy and how to just to deal with this. And just to end question, because, for example, from Ukrainian government, it's sometimes, not sometimes, but often questions about if it, for security purposes, better if it's like national platform, not like to like part of Amazon or like part on, I don't know, Uber, for example. I mean, but it's like national platform because it's like safety controlled by government. Thank you.
That's a great question, and it is something that we haven't talked about. To the extent that we become, that is individuals, consumers, citizens, to the extent that we become reliant on giant platforms, that means that if there is an attack or we're blocked from using that, all of the other avenues that we have for acquiring things are going to be attenuated. And you asked it in a very terrific way. Forgive me, if I spoke Ukrainian, we wouldn't have to be speaking English. So I apologize for that, and I thank you for taking your shot. Don't we need national platforms instead of international platforms? And the reason we need national platforms is that it gives you an avenue for attack for outsiders. All I have to do is deny you access to the supply chain where you have come to depend on. Maybe Amazon is a fine example, as you say. So I just wrote a piece for the American Institute for Economic Research where because I've always been a big fan of division of labor, and these large firms, they're going to really save us a lot of money because there are such big economies of scale from division of labor. But if you look at the devastation from the fragility of supply chains, so we get a ship that's stuck in the Suez Canal, or Houthi rebels are firing missiles out into the Red Sea, and so ships have to go all the way around Africa. So we see big increases in supply chains, and those are physical things. You can get the same sort of interruption. Maybe instead of firing missiles, Houthi rebels all learn how to do programming and they become hackers. and they make it impossible for a country to use Amazon. So we're denied access to this, the supply chain that we've become dependent on just to get groceries in the store and for people to be able to work in manufacturing facilities, because we have just-in-time delivery for parts. So all of the things that make for efficiency also make for fragility. Everything that makes the system more efficient also makes it more fragile. And every one of these points, there's a single point failure all along the line. All you have to do is interrupt at some point. So you block Amazon, you have some sort of attack in one of the parts of the supply chain, and the whole system is so fragile that people are going to say, well, forget this, we're going to go back to national platforms. And I don't know the answer, but I'm glad you raised that question because I think it's very important. But we have seen examples in the last couple of years that I think should give us pause about some of the optimism that people had 5 years ago that this system was going to work. So thank you for that question.
Thank you, Ludmila, and
Thank you a lot for your answer.
thank you, Ludmila. Thank you, Mike. I see we also have a question from Alec. Alec, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks for the couple second delay with my computer. So thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting. I want to come back to the example with Estonia that you used, and maybe you could talk a little bit more about this, because it does sound something that we need where I am. There's a pothole that is 11 years old on a major road.
You're having birthdays for it. That's nice. You can have a cake and candles.
Right, and nothing is happening, and it's a central road, and every day there's traffic jam, but it's not because of the potholes, it's because how heavily the road is used. How do we get the community on this? Are there any examples of such interconnections that you can think of, maybe? Or maybe if not, how do we go with that?
Well, people have, the reason I used Estonia as an example is that there actually were a couple of Estonian towns that tried to use it. And honestly, so far, at least, it hasn't worked very well. So all of the examples so far are negative. I am putting some links into the chat. I put up the unicorn video, and I put up the article that I wrote about fragility from Ludmila's question. But the last one I put there is about the future of public goods, where I wrote about some of the problems and challenges. But Alexander, as far as I know, there are no public entities that have started to use this yet. It is a possibility that the sort of people who, like me, are excessively excited about blockchain always say, well, this is possible. Maybe it's possible, but there are no examples of it working yet. And there are some examples of people trying it and saying, you know, we're going to go back and not do that. So there's a first mover sort of problem. I'm trying not to look at Emanuela, but this is the sort of thing that a large international agency might think of trying to do some kind of proof of concept, because it's going to be very difficult for an individual Estonian village to say, let's take a chance on this, because it actually has to work. Whereas some large international agency might be able to encourage by having some sort of demonstration project, because it wouldn't be very expensive to try to switch it over. And maybe you could get someone to write the software. Once the software exists and has actually been debugged, then it's easier to adopt. So that's the thing that is great about software, is that, well, software is to jobs and service jobs as automation and robotics are to manufacturing jobs, because they can displace the people who work in service positions. And so that's also true for a lot of bureaucratic positions. So that you've got someone whose job it is to check applications and issue licenses. But you could do that online with software as long as you get to the point where it's actually reliable. And there's going to be less corruption. And they don't take lunch breaks. So it's open 24 hours. So having software replace local government officials, obviously a number of local government officials are going to oppose this because they'll lose their jobs. And citizens aren't going to be sure because we don't have universal access. I'm not on a website. I want to talk to a person. Old people like me always say that. I don't want some website. I want to talk to a person. But I think young people are more and more willing to do this. So we're in a process where if we could just make a little progress pretty quickly, we might see the transformation start to take off. But I have to admit, as far as I know, all of the examples at this point are negative.
I understand. I'm interested also because I've been proposing something similar in the field that I'm working in, so diaspora and connecting talent and country development, especially in the region. So a simple website could solve the problem, but the software is what's missing.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Alec, for your question. I think we have time for one more question, and I see that, Colin, you've raised your hand. So please, Colin, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. And sorry for not having my video on. It's 1 a.m. here in Australia, so the look is not good. But lovely presentation, Mike. And but yeah, in fact, we work in the platform ecosystem space, talking about these sort of concepts of public-private partnerships. In fact, we have launched such a scenario. This was for the Department of Buildings in Washington, D.C. So they had the exact problem.
That is certainly a primitive area.
It sure is. It sure is. And yes, something transpired there which sort of explains some of the pushback. But yeah, they had challenges meeting the demand for inspections by public sector inspectors. So we created a public-private partnership, and now private enterprise inspectors are seamlessly bookable by developers and even individuals. And the ecosystem that we have is definitely extensible to all types of inspections, and for that matter, the gig economy in terms of doing services. So, Alexandra, I'd love to chat, but definitely this is proving out. We don't do blockchain; it's traditional payments and not smart contracts. But being an APIs for everything platform, we could definitely integrate into smart contracts and handle payments via crypto or otherwise. But yeah, no, it's definitely been interesting. There was a significant pushback by the incumbents, such that it went to the mayor of DC, and she had to make a call to either keep it alive or kill it. And luckily, she saw the light and the upside, and it has survived. So yeah, very excited. That's one of the reasons I wanted to attend today, was just hear what the discussion and discourse was around platform ecosystems and how we may be involved and help.
Well, it sounds to me like you should have given the talk instead of me, because you actually have more practical experience. You raise a point which is a good one, and it probably is a note of caution. So one of the problems that developing nations always face in this space is problems of corruption. So in India, for example, the need to get inspections for buildings or changes, it takes months. There's a bunch of different chops that you have to get. And the problem is that many of those inspectors have, in effect, negative salaries. That is, they pay their boss for the right to have a franchise to accept bribes. And it's just understood that these bribes are a part of the cost of doing business. The problem is that offering those bribes displaces the function of the inspector. That is, it's not that I go to your building and I say it's acceptable if you have engaged in proper building practices. It's, do you pay the bribe that I ask? And then I give you the chop and you can go ahead. Then the building, of course, falls down. It's a school and it kills children. So the difficulty is that I come in and I say, well, I'm a consultant and I've written books and I've thought about this. And what we need to do is reduce corruption. And then this young engineer says, hell no, I paid for this job fair and square. This job is an income producing asset. And so the Douglas North claimed that that kind of corruption becomes locked in. It's very difficult to pay off the illegal but very real rents that come from participating in this kind of corrupt system. And so when a government leader says, and they're right, if we could get rid of corruption, things would be better. Well, it'd be better for the citizens. It would be really bad for all the people who hold power in the government to do this, and they will fight to the last breath to prevent it. And that is my impression of quite a bit of DC. So, Colin, I can see why the mayor may have been reluctant to go along with this, because a lot of those people are also voters. And a lot of voters don't care that much, but boy, the government officials that now perform the inspections after a 6-month wait, they rely on those kind of what Coast would call side payments for their income. And so it's corruption, once it's in place, is very difficult to root out, because it becomes a sort of alternative side economy, a gray economy in which things are being transacted. And one of the things that's being transacted is that those inspections. But clearly, if we could break through that and have those inspections then done from a website, they're done by privately licensed inspectors who can be fired if they perform badly, that's a way better system. But the transition from one system to another is extremely challenging for developing nations like Washington, D.C.
Yes, it took a very passionate and visionary director in the Department of Buildings to see it through.
Yeah.
Of course, we were just the supporting technology behind it, but it's transformed the space from
absolutely. Oh, the merits of it. The merits are unquestionable. It's a political problem.
Yes, agreed.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you again, Colin, for your question. Just a quick check if there's any last questions to be raised from the floor. I don't see any additional hands. But unfortunately, also looking at the time, this is all we have planned for today. As they say, time flies when you're having fun. So unfortunately, we have to close the discussion. Before I wrap up, I would be grateful if those who participated could quickly fill out a short evaluation form. We're eager to improve these expert discussions and ensure that they're most relevant to our participants. So please take a few minutes to fill out the form. And for those who would like to know more about what we discussed today, I would invite you to, first of all, look into the resources that Mike has kindly posted in the chat. Also, listen to the Innovations Matters podcast episode that we recorded a while back with Mike. I'm personally very intrigued about watching this video on you and the unicorn. So that's the first thing I'm going to do after we close. So yeah, once again, thank you very much, Mike, for taking the time to speak with us today. It's been a great pleasure, as usual. And thank you also to the participants for your insightful discussion, questions and comments. And yeah, please join us for the next expert discussion on 18th of April with Alexander Gevorkian. So as you quickly alluded to, we'll be speaking with you about industrial policy, diaspora economics, and new economic development models for post-socialist transition economies. So please don't forget to tune in. And thanks again, Mike. I hope you enjoyed the discussion as much as I did, and I'm looking forward to speaking with you again, hopefully in the future.
It was great. Thank you. And thanks to the audience for showing up.
Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining.
Bye.
See you soon.